Welcome to the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible but were afraid to ask. I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
And I'm Katie Langston. And today on the podcast, we are doing another lightning round episode, which is when we take several questions that have been submitted from our users and listeners and answer them in sort of somewhat more rapid fire succession. I mean, they're, we give time to the questions that they need.
We like to talk, so,
We do. So it's hard to,
it's hard to give short answers. But
exactly.
we're
not the best at that. But anyway, but if you would like to submit a question, dear listener, please go to the Enter the Bible website, enterthebible.org, and there's a little button up there that says Got Questions, and you can click on that and submit your own question, and we do all that we can to answer them here on the podcast. Okay.
All right.
So we'll dive in.
Yep.
Kathryn,
Yes.
the question for you is...
Yes. Drum roll.
I've heard there will be two who return prior to Christ's return. One is Elijah. Who is the second one?
Well, that is a good question.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to answer it with my Old Testament hat on, because I think that's what this question is getting at. But if we're not getting at the question you're asking, then please resubmit your question. But there is a longstanding Jewish tradition that comes up at basically the end of the Old Testament period.
Okay.
And we can see reflections of it, for instance, in the prophet Malachi, that says that before the Messiah comes, the Christos in Greek, Messiah is Christos,
right?
The anointed one.
Yep. It's not Jesus's last name.
Not Jesus's last name. It's Jesus' title, basically.
Jesus
the Messiah.
Yes,
yeah, the anointed one. Yeah. So there's this longstanding Jewish tradition that before the Christ comes, before the Messiah comes, Elijah will return and the prophet.
Okay.
So let me explain just quickly. So Elijah, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, right? So Elijah is this Old Testament prophet in 1 Kings, who primarily in 1 Kings, who resists the bad king Ahab. Elijah famously defeats the prophets of Baal,
right.
And then is marked for death by Jezebel, and so he runs away into the wilderness and just asks to be killed. It's kind of pastoral burnout, prophetic burnout, Elijah. And then he is given a vision or hears the still small voice or the sound of sheer sight. So lots of stories about Elijah in 1st and 2nd Kings. And also famously, Elijah does not die. He is taken up into heaven in a fiery chariot.
Yeah, there's a chariot of fire.
Exactly.
Yes.
And Elisha, his successor, watches this happen.
Okay.
So then Jewish tradition said, well, Elijah didn't die. He's, taken up bodily alive into heaven. And so he will return before the Messianic age, before the Messiah. He'll be like the precursor, the prophet.
So he was just hanging out there?
Yeah.
He's just like, here I am.
There he is.
In heaven.
With Enoch, who's also taken alive.
Who's also up there.
Right.
All right.
Yes.
How do you get to be one of those guys?
I don't know. Okay. Kill 400 prophets of Baal, maybe?
Oh, okay. Well, all right.
Probably not a good idea.
I think we should not endorse violence.
Probably
on this
not. All right, we can strike that. I don't know. You become a prophet who, does
really cool things.
Does really cool things.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yes, do not seek out prophets of Baal, please. So that's Elijah. So he'll come back before the Messiah comes. And pretty sure, I believe it is Malachi who talks about, I will send Elijah before the great and terrible day.
Yeah, that is there.
Yeah.
They'll turn the hearts of the children
to their
parents or whatever.
Yes.
I don't know, Mormons love that verse.
Go on. Yeah. The second one is just the prophet. So, and this is a little more obscure. So there's this passage in Deuteronomy 18, and I'm going to come back to this actually for a third question for this lightning round. But or not so lightning round. So in Deuteronomy 18, God is speaking, or Moses is actually speaking, and he's it's kind of his final sermon, which is really long in Deuteronomy before he dies, and he says. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet. I will raise, and then a few verses later in verse 18, I will raise for them a prophet like you from among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet who shall speak to them everything that I command. So likely in the original context, this just means God will periodically raise up prophets like Moses, like Elijah, like Nathan, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, right?
Okay.
But it came to be understood in Jewish tradition as one singular prophet that God would raise up, like Moses, at the end of days to herald the coming of the Messiah, of the Christ. So the interesting thing is we see that Jewish tradition in the New Testament a few different places, but one is in particular in John chapter 1. We're talking about John the Baptist here. So John, it says in John 1:19, the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask John the Baptist, "Who are you?" He confessed and did not deny it, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." Right? Not the Messiah. And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" Interesting question. Yes. He said, "I am not." Then they asked, "Are you the prophet?"
Oh.
He answered, "No." Then they said to him, "Who are you? Let us have an answer. If you're not, why are you baptizing if you're neither the Messiah nor Elijah nor the prophet?" So this shows this Jewish tradition, right? That in the Messianic age, it's first Elijah and the prophet, like Moses, and then the Messiah. The interesting thing, of course, is then on the Mount of Transfiguration, who do you get?
Elijah and Moses.
Elijah and Moses.
And Jesus.
And Jesus. So again, it fulfills that Jewish tradition that Elijah and the prophet will come with or before the Messiah. Reaching back to the book of Deuteronomy, to the book of Malachi, to the book of First Kings, and then we see it in the New Testament as well. And of course, even today at Passover meals, perhaps you know this tradition, right? There's a place set for Elijah, an empty spot, an empty seat with a place setting for Elijah, because again, Elijah is
promised
to come before the Messiah.
So, but what I sense in this question is, I think maybe like a premillennialist, which is a fancy word for, they have maybe a very developed sense, like sort of like the Left Behind kind of sense of what the end of the world will be. And what I think this person is asking is, there will be two who return prior to Christ's return.
Right.
So I think they're conflating these things, because I think, listener, what we would say is that it already happened, and that happened at the Mount of Transfiguration, and it's not going to happen again, right? Like Christ will return, but the two who were to returned when he came the first time. And we're not, we don't have an expectation for that to happen again.
Right.
Right.
And in fact,
that's how they announced. That's how they knew that Jesus was the Messiah,
right?
because they came to
Elijah
and Moses were on the Mount of Transfiguration.
We should just mention also that John the Baptist himself is often is a few times in the Gospels referred to as Elijah, even though he denies that in John. In the Synoptic Gospels, it says Elijah has already come. Jesus says, and that seems, and it's John the Baptist. So
interesting.
Yeah.
And is Jesus sometimes thought of as the one like Moses himself? Is Jesus himself thought of that, or not? Not really.
There's certainly some echoes in Jesus' ministry of Moses, but no, I think Jesus is the
Messiah. He's not the one like Moses,
right?
And we would understand the one like Moses to be literally Moses,
right?
On the Mount of Transfiguration.
On the Mount of Transfiguration, yeah. So I think,
and all the other prophets that like Isaiah, Elijah, Jeremiah, those guys.
Right. So like many scriptural passages, it can mean more than one thing at the same time. So Deuteronomy 18 and Malachi. But I think your point is really the most important thing, that we believe as Christians this has already happened, right? That Moses or the prophet like Moses and Elijah have already come. And most importantly, of course, the Messiah has already come.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Awesome. All right. So another question, and I think this is a good one because there's also some good Old Testament stuff in here. Why do we believe that Sunday is the right day for Sabbath?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's define Sabbath real quick. So
Yeah.
Sabbath is, of course, the Jewish
Day of rest.
day of rest, and it's Saturday.
Right.
Right?
And literally, right?
Right,
It's the
yeah,
6th day, the 7th day. It's
yeah,
literally,
right.
I see it. And I said the 6th because I'm already thinking of like our current weekend structure. Monday is the first day, right? But yeah.
But yeah, I mean, usually, I mean, even today we think of Sunday as the first day of the week,
Yeah. Right.
right? Not the first day of the work week, but the first day. And so then the seventh day is Saturday, and that's the Sabbath. In the Jewish reckoning of time and Israelite, the Sabbath starts at sundown on Friday
Mhm.
and ends at sundown on Saturday.
Mhm.
So 24-hour period, more or less.
Mhm.
Day of rest, right? Well, so the first Christians are Jews,
Right.
right? Jesus
Was a Jew.
was a Jew.
Don't
Peter,
Jew.
James,
Also a Jew.
John,
Also a Jew. Paul.
Paul,
Paul was a
very
Jew.
righteous Jew,
Yes, he was.
Pharisee, in fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they, being good Jews, being
Yeah.
good observant Jews, observe the Sabbath,
Right.
right? So lots of examples in the Gospels and in Acts of and some references in Paul's epistles to the early Christians, the early Jewish Christians who are the early Christians, observing the Sabbath.
Mhm.
But then what happens on Sunday, of course, Sunday is notable because that is the day of the resurrection,
Right.
right? So the Gospels say early on the first day of the week, right? Sunday. The women went to the tomb and they find it empty, right? So it seems to be the case, and there's, of course, scholars love to argue, so,
Sure.
there's people who disagree with this, but it seems to be the case that the early Christians, these Jewish Christians, observed the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath, and also gathered on Sunday morning, the day of the resurrection, or sometime on Sunday, the day of the resurrection, to worship together, to break
Have a
bread
meal.
together,
Right.
to celebrate that day of the resurrection. Well, as the church expands from just Jews to Gentiles, which of course we read about in the book of Acts
Yep.
and in some of the epistles, gradually that idea of the Sabbath gets kind of transferred to Sunday, the day
Yeah.
of the resurrection. And so there is in 321 AD or CE, Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, who converts to Christianity, issues an edict that Sunday shall be the day of rest throughout the Roman Empire. And he doesn't say everybody has to worship, but he says that's the day of rest, and he makes exceptions for farmers in this edict. But it seems to be the case that Christians, even before this, are
resting,
are kind of celebrating Sabbath on Sunday,
Mhm.
and probably still Jewish Christians may be doing both, right?
Yeah.
Saturday and then worshiping on Sunday.
Yeah.
But gradually, as the church becomes more and more Gentile, this idea of Sabbath gets transferred to Sunday, to
Yeah.
the day of the resurrection.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
There you go.
Of course, we should mention there are Christian denominations that still celebrate Sabbath,
And they
most
worship on
notably the
Seventh
Seventh-day
Day Adventists.
Adventists,
Right.
who hold Saturday as the day of worship and rest.
Yes. And but there is a passage in Paul that says you don't have to do that. But I don't
Yeah,
remember where that's at.
yeah.
Something like your festivals and your Sabbaths.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking 1 Corinthians, but I'm not sure. Like, don't condemn each other if you're observing different days, he says.
Yeah.
Because it's not,
It's not that
it's not critical
Yeah.
as to which day you observe. There are a couple of places in, I think it's in Acts and in 1 Corinthians where it mentions the first day of the week as a day when the Christians break bread together and offer offerings for the disciples in Jerusalem. So
cool. I like it.
Yeah. Of
All right.
course, well, in our current culture, Sunday,
Yeah,
whatever.
there's no
may,
such thing as a day of rest.
there may be no day of rest. It's a 24/7, but
Yeah,
to our detriment, right? I
right.
mean, we need to reclaim that idea of rest. I
Yeah,
think, both for our own sake, for the sake of our
yeah,
world, for
yeah.
instead of just going and going and going and going, we
Yes.
need to
The world
embrace
will
that
be
idea of
okay
rest.
without us for a day.
Yeah,
It really is like a practice of faith
yeah,
that, like, actually it's not all on our shoulders, and
exactly.
we're kind of silly to imagine that it is.
Yep,
So,
an act of faith that God is God and we are not.
mhm,
Yep. Yeah. Well, and then the last question, I think, yeah, both of us probably have a lot to say about this.
mhm,
So the question is short, but it's really interesting. So the question is, how do Christians tell if a preacher is of God or false?
mm.
So
Yeah,
what would you say
off
off
the
the bat?
top.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is, it's a marvelous question. It's an incredibly pertinent question in an era of all kinds of information,
Hmm.
most of it nonsense, um, you know,
Disinformation.
disinformation, and people with competing claims and worldviews and all kinds of things. Even to an, I mean, there's always been nonsense in the world. Let's not pretend otherwise. But the rate at which nonsense can be perpetuated in our, thanks to the
At
internet
lightning speed.
at lightning speed, as it were.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a really important question, and certainly a lot of people do those spread nonsense in the name of God. We hear
Hmm.
that all the time. Um, so it's a really, I think it's a really important and particularly pertinent question for our moment that we're in
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've sort of come to think of for this is I want to ask uh, to whom and and to what is the preacher pointing?
Yeah. That's a great question.
So I think when I have heard, I'm going to say, false prophets
Yeah.
speak,
Yeah.
often they have said, "Follow me,
Mhm.
follow the prophet,"
Mhm.
right? "Follow me."
Mhm.
And a true prophet or a true preacher will say, "Follow Christ."
Yep. Yep.
And the trick, though, is that sometimes people they'll say follow Christ, but then the things that entails have nothing to do with Christ.
Right.
So you have to take it a step beyond that as well. So first is follow Christ, and then second is the way of Christ reflected in their teachings.
Yeah.
So is it about self-aggrandizement? Is it about riches? Is it
Mhm.
about wealth? Is it about power?
Mhm.
Or is it about giving away?
Mhm.
Is it about caring for the neighbor?
Mhm.
Is it about
Self-sacrificial love.
self-sacrificial love?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
about caring and tending to the poor and the
Yeah.
needy
Yeah, yeah.
and the
Yep.
outcasts? Uh,
What Jesus did.
exactly. Do the teachings move you into what I would use the term a cruciform life,
Mm.
a life that is shaped by the cross
Yeah.
of Christ?
Yeah.
Or do the teachings point you to, naming it and claiming it,
Right.
or,
Right. Or
s-
send me money and you'll
yeah,
be
and you'll
rewarded
be blessed, and
fourfold or whatever. Yeah.
exactly. And if it's not the former, right? If it's not inviting you into a life, into the death and resurrection of Christ, then that's a false teacher.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you find they're everywhere.
Yep.
They're on TV. They're
Pulpits.
in our
Yeah.
pulpits. I mean,
Yeah.
you got to be careful.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. It's a really pertinent question, and it reminds me of, so 10 years ago, I lived in Ethiopia for a year. I
Hmm.
taught Ethiopian students at a Lutheran seminary there, the Mekane Yesus Seminary, and they asked this very similar question. They said, "How can you tell a true prophet from a false prophet?"
Yep.
Which threw me for a while. I've never heard that question from an American
Mm.
student, because I think it's not as common.
People aren't claiming to be prophets
They're
all
not claiming to be
around.
prophets. They
I
don't
mean,
use that
they
word
are, but they're
as
not. Like
right,
some of them are, but
right,
yeah.
right, right, right. But it's I think it's the same question, right? How do you tell if a preacher is of God or false? How do you tell a true preacher or prophet from a false prophet? And I just want to, and I came up with a list, right, for
Sure.
my students,
Yeah.
and you've already said a lot of this, so I won't repeat that. But I think we can look to Scripture,
Yeah.
to for the answers to that question as well. So I had referred earlier in this episode, in this podcast, to Deuteronomy 18 about the prophet that God's going to
Mhm.
send, like Moses. But it goes on in that chapter to talk about how do you tell a true prophet,
Mhm.
and God says, anyone who does not. Oh, sorry. Any prophet who speaks in the name of other gods or
Mm.
who presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, that prophet shall die. So I think, one easy answer is if a prophet or preacher speaks in the name of someone other than Jesus,
Mm.
then that's an obvious clue that
Yeah.
that's a false prophet,
Yeah.
right, or preacher. And it goes on to say, if that prophet's word doesn't come true, then they're false. Well, that's great, except usually you have to know it in the moment, and you
Right.
can't wait 20
I
years
know,
to,
right? There's a
right?
lot of retrospect
Yeah.
involved and like, "Oh, did that or did
Did
that
that,
not
yeah,
come
yeah,
true?"
yeah.
Like, you can't always know
So I
for a
think
while.
I think that the what you talked about is really key, right? That who does the prophet call you to follow, or who does the preacher call you to follow? If it's not Jesus, then something's wrong. And well, Jesus himself addresses this in Matthew 7. He says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits.
Mhm.
I think that's,
Mhm.
related to what you were saying too, right? What are the fruits of this preacher's life, right? Is
Mhm.
it a personal jet, right, and a mansion?
Mhm.
Or is it a life of self-sacrificial love
Mhm.
and care for God's
Mhm.
people and working for justice and that
Mhm.
sort of thing? So you'll know them by their fruits. Um, they don't seek self-promotion or riches. I think about Elisha in Second
Mhm.
Kings 5 when Naaman the Syrian, when he heals Naaman the
Mm.
Syrian,
Yeah.
and Naaman wants to give him gold and
Right.
silver and
And he's
all
like,
these
yeah.
luxury goods, and Elisha's like, no,
Yeah.
right? Doesn't seek riches. And the true prophet doesn't seek to be a prophet.
Yeah, they just you do not wanna be a prophet.
Yeah,
That's the worst, man. Being a prophet is the worst,
yeah,
and, like, the people that sort of leap to being one, or, like, wanna call themselves a prophet,
yeah.
that's a clue
That kind of
too.
ego trip
Yeah,
is a clue to being a false teacher or prophet.
yeah.
I would just add one more, and this is maybe not quite as important, but I think it's still worth saying that a true prophet or preacher is concerned both with justice and with morality, or
Mhm,
both with personal sin and with societal sin.
mhm,
So I feel like, in the church, to put it generally, the progressive side of the church is all concerned about the isms and societal sin
mhm,
and not so much about individual
mhm,
morality.
mhm,
And, again, a generalization, but the right side of the church is concerned only with personal morality
mhm,
and doesn't talk about,
mhm.
in general, doesn't talk about racism or
Or systemic injustice.
sexism or systemic injustice, right? So I feel like the true preacher or prophet, uh, in scripture, the prophets are concerned with both, right?
Yeah,
They're concerned with idolatry, but they're also concerned with injustice.
yeah,
They're concerned with sexual morality, but they're also concerned with, feeding the hungry and
yeah,
taking care of the
right.
poor. Um, so yeah, I think that the true preacher can't be pigeonholed into
Yeah.
one
When I've
political
seen
position or
yeah,
another.
when I've seen people that I think, that really strike me as, like, getting it, it's like, it's kind of impossible to pin them down.
Yeah,
You kinda you
yeah,
you kinda could never know,
yeah,
like, where they stood on, in the at least in the sort of partisan
right.
wars of, contemporary American society. You're kinda like, "Are you a liberal? Are you a
Yeah,
conservative?
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
can't
yeah.
tell what you are," because there's something there that's deeper than
More
that.
foundational, yeah.
Yeah.
I think about I'm a big fan of Pope Francis,
Mhm.
right? Big
Yeah,
fan
he's
of.
he's a lot that way,
He
yeah.
is, like, when he came to visit in the United States when Obama was president. Neither the Republicans nor Democrats could claim him completely, right? Because he's pro-life across the board, right? Pro or anti-abortion, pro-environment, pro-immigrant,
anti-death penalty,
pro-refugee, anti-death penalty.
Yeah,
I feel like that really is the mark of a good preacher, a good spiritual leader, someone who can't be co-opted. Yeah, that's a great word. Yeah,
by political, partisan political movement.
Yeah. Having said all that, of course, preachers are human beings, sinners and
People.
saints,
Yep.
sinners and saints at the same time. So give them some slack too,
right.
or give them some grace.
Yeah. Well, and
they're not always going to get it right.
No, they're not always going to get it right, and ultimately, it's Christ, right?
Yes.
Ultimately, it's God that we're concerned with, right? And so we don't need our preachers to be perfect,
right?
Because God has given us His grace.
Yeah. We in fact pray for our preachers, pray for our leaders, pray for our preachers, that they might know God more and more, and be people of integrity and mercy and grace and wisdom. Yeah. So.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, listeners, so much for being with us today on this lightning round episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. And you can get more commentary, resources, reflections, conversations at our website, enterthebible.org. And of course, please, if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, rate us and review us. Be sure to subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, rate, like us, subscribe, mash that subscribe button. I heard that's what the kids say these days on YouTube.
Sounds violent.
It does sound violent. So maybe just tap it gently. And of course, be sure to share the podcast with a friend. Until next time.